Heads everywhere, just about. Oh well. You realize that we have people that basically could never understand what we're trying to learn in this class because they don't even have the basic skills sets to be able to get into this kind of thing. Like you guys, you guys got it. I just fill in the nooks and the crannies, but boy, we have a whole generation of people coming up who just don't seem to be able to think right, or think at all. I mean, for goodness sakes. I'm not sure what we're going to do about that. Anyway, I love looking into this Greek stuff, and so we're going to try to move into this as much as we can, as deep as we can, but this is really complicated stuff. And the reason it's complicated is because we've got this word, pistis. I didn't put in as a word of the day again, but pistis means to be persuaded by a logical argument. Unfortunately, this is a word that keeps getting translated as faith and belief. There is no word for faith and belief in the New Testament in Greek. We got it in English, that's special. But the word is pistis, meaning to be persuaded. To have been persuaded is pisteo. Yes, sir?
When did faith, when did that word start being used? Any background on that?
Was it the Latin, or the Greek to Latin?
It's the Greek to Latin.
But they had to have had the concept before then, right? Or wasn't it? I'm saying the Greeks, I'm saying that.
There has been a tissit. We are the problem, okay? If you read Last Mohicans, one of the characters in Last Mohicans is, one of the most famous characters in Last Mohicans is not an Indian. It is the preacher. You guys remember the preacher in Last Mohicans? The itinerant preacher. Totally untrained, no knowledge of Greek, no knowledge of Latin, no knowledge of anything that was commonly, this is really important stuff, and stuff we don't know. I've been writing about this in my blogs about history, because to us, our event horizon is what we know. And the longest event horizon for most of us is, 50, 60, 70 years, some of us 80 years, but your event horizon is what you know. So the whole world was like this. No, the whole world was not like this. 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, every educated person knew Latin and Greek. They didn't, ancient Greek is a dead language. They knew Koinonia and classical Greek, and they read it, and they read Latin. Every educated person, from the tiniest tot to the most, whatever, every educated person. Something happened, though, on the way to Jerusalem. Something happened on the way to freedom. It was the United States of America. Our educational process, except for the wealthy, did not include that. If you are a person in England today, and you go to an English grammar school, they have three types of schools. They have the public schools, they have the grammar schools, which are public, and then they have private schools. The private grammar schools for the intelligent will train you in Latin and Greek today. You'll learn 3 or 4 languages before you're out in Britain, if you're the average educated person. United States of America, we stopped teaching that. The reason we stopped teaching that, why did we stop teaching it?
They hated Democrats.
No.
They require you to learn their language, and it's usually Spanish.
The reason we stopped teaching is because we had translations of the Bible. The reason people learned to read in the past, the primary reason is not education. As we said, to them, the reason people learned to read was so they could read the Bible. That's the reason they learned. The most popular books that were owned was number 1, the Bible, and number 2, Fox's Book of Martyrs by American people. But you could only buy a Bible about 1826, remember? Because that's when they started becoming cheap enough for the average person to own. Homes did not have Bibles. The assumption, though, was that even when you had translations, the assumption was that your pastor or your priest would be able to do what?
Explain it to you.
He could explain it to you, yeah. He knew the Greek and he knew the Latin. And so when it came up, he knew that, I think it's fidelis. There's the words in Latin. I'm not a Latin expert, okay? I know about Greek, and I know a little bit about Hebrew and a lot about Anglo-Saxon. But the Romans, you know, the big deal with the Romans is the Romans, the translations, we knew it was translated, and we knew about Jerome. And so you expected your pastor to know Latin and Greek, and he could explain to you. And so in his sermons, he told you all about how pistis did not mean faith, even though your Bible said it said faith, right? Right? And he taught you about agape. But something happened on the way to Jerusalem. Something happened on the way to where we are today, and that's the itinerant preachers that happened in the age of the, the last Mohicans, which is the late 1700s and the early 1800s. Because in the age of enlightenment, which is what we're talking about, moving from the age of enlightenment to the age of industrialization, what happened was the average home got their own Bibles. And they could read them. Today we don't read our Bibles, so that's okay. But the average home, got their own Bibles, and that's what they had to read. And guess what? That's about all they had to read, other than Fox's Book of Martyrs. Because it was too expensive to own books. Do you remember there was a time when books were expensive? Now you can get them for $1.95, 50 cents, or free, right? Gutenberg Project. And you read every book that's out of copyright today, right now, for free. People don't read, but that's okay. You can still get them. I'm just saying, the big deal was what happened to the average scholar. And by the way, we saw, and I don't know, I've talked about this before, the ascent of doctrine. There are 5 basic theologies and 5 basic doctrines. The ascent of the modern doctrines that are called anti-creedal. The anti-creedal, and I'm not negative about the anti-creedal doctrines. The anti-liturgical, anti-creedal. You know what the anti-creedal groups are, right? Baptist, Church of Christ, Baptist. To a degree, the Methodists are a little bit, they've become that way, but not so much. They're still creedal. You see a lot of mainstreams, the mainstreams that are creedal or liturgical, we call them liturgical or creedal. The creedal groups are the ones that basically say the creeds, the apostolic creeds, the Nicene creeds, the Anastasian creed. The creedals are the Orthodox, Catholic, Episcopalian, Anglican, Lutheran. The anti-creedal are those who don't. And the reason for the rise of anti-creedalism is because what's the purpose of the creed in history?
It's a summation of beliefs.
The summation of your belief. What did the anti-creedals say? If you say, what do you believe? They hold up a Bible. That's what they believe. The creedals, if you ask a creedal person what do you believe, and I put this in my books, I love it. I had an ancient character who basically they asked, what do you believe? And she immediately goes into the creed in Latin, the Nicene Creed in Latin, because that's what she believes. She didn't have a Bible. Matter of fact, did Martin Luther have a Bible? Yeah, he found one that was attached to the wall when he was 30 years old, right? And it was chained to the wall. Because I told you, books, we see a library and we think a library. Take one of these rows and that's a library in the ancient world. Take one of these books and all the books were chained because they were so valuable, right? In that era. So, we think books are ubiquitous, but they're not in that ancient period. They're not easy to get a hold of. They're expensive. And people who are able to read and understand them are few and far between. The anti-creedals began about the 1830s. Why? Because they suddenly got a hold of Bibles. And they had Bibles in their home. And this is where, by the way, the anti-creedals are all evangelical. We are evangelical, but we came by it from a different way. We're all Brockians. And Brock made a terrible mistake, okay? But that's another whole. I mean, this is a whole semester's worth of stuff. We're talking about it in like 5 minutes. This is terrible. But there's huge stuff into this. But the reason we think the way we do is because, and I'm not against it, but because you have a translation, you trust your translation, right? But it's not the translation that matters. What matters is what it says in the Greek. What did Jesus say? And by the way, don't you love it? The main statement of Tübingen School and Q, right? Tübingen School and Q say what? You don't have the actual words of Christ. Right? What happened? In the beginning, because they were Aramaic speakers, they wrote the Gospels supposedly in Aramaic. Or they wrote, there are two different types of Q. Well, Q is supposed to be a sayings gospel, right? So when they wrote an Aramaic sayings gospel, and then somebody translated it into Greek. So therefore, you don't have the true words of Christ. But we know is, no, that's totally false. There is no Q. Tübingen School is wrong. It isn't written in Aramaic. If it's written in Aramaic, they're nutheads, right? Why would you quote what Jesus says? If all of his words are Aramaic, why would you quote things in Aramaic that he said? Right? So Jesus has to be a Greek speaker, period. Plus, all the Gospels are written in Greek, and not only written in Greek, well, all the letters are written in Greek. They never said that they said that Jesus read Hebrew. Did anybody speak Hebrew in that period? No. Hebrew was a dead language. They read it. They didn't speak it. So, anyway, I mean, this stuff gets really complicated because history is not a bumper sticker. But people love to make it a bumper sticker because if I make it a bumper sticker, I can simplify it and destroy it. If you simplify it and destroy it, then there is no history. Anyway, these things get really complicated. I'm sorry, but I think it's good to take a little bit of time to talk about this. And at some place, maybe I'll teach you classes of this, but this is really, really deep information. Anyway, Misthapodotes. All right, this is one of those long words. I'll give you the breakout here. This is mistheu, to pay for service, from mithus. Mistos, to pay for service, to allow for wages, from misto. Apo, there's apo. And apo, see, what's the other one? Apo and didomai. Didomai is common. Didomai is a very common Greek, means to give. Apo means to off. So, and mistos means to let out for pay, for wages. So, let out for pay, off give. What does that mean? All right. It means specifically in Greek a remunerator. And so it is what is left. Okay, so if I let out for pay, it's the off give of let out for pay, which is a remunerator. And in other words, what's left over, right? A remunerator is what's left over. Now, if you remember, we had not a para, but a bolo word. Remember that? And I can't remember what the bolo word was, but we had another bolo word that meant specifically and exactly the remunerator of, like, for example, an equation, right? Remember a remunerator equation, when I have a division, if I have something that's not divisible, 99 divisible by 25, right? I'm going to have leftover remunerator, right? So the word before was the physical remunerator of a, I guess you write it like this, of an equation, for example. And remember, the Greeks could not do math the way we do math because they could only do geometric math. So they really, to them, Okay, pi is not a renumerator, but what's the problem with pi?
Repeating, is that?
Yeah, it's an irrational number, right?
Repeating.
Pi is an irrational number. You know that, right? Pi does not exist numerically. You know why? It's irrational. Because it doesn't end. Any number that doesn't end is irrational. However, I can state certain irrational numbers as a rational fraction. Right? So they're still real, but they're not rational. Which is, okay. Remember this number theory that we all learned way back when, right? You said, I'd never need that ever again. I was thinking about moles and molarity as I was driving to church today. I was thinking, I haven't used those in a bazillion years, but that's all chemical stuff, right? But anyway, so the Greeks understood a lot of these concepts. Matter of fact, one of the reasons that pi was the Osirian Mysterion's mystery. Why is it? Okay, you're all jaundiced, right? We're all jaundiced. We don't care. Pi equals 3.1416 ... forever, right? But you know what? When that was discovered, people were like astounded. And they were astounded for a long time. So astounded that it became the mystery of the Osirian Mysterion. What a cool thing, right? And there's other numbers that are like that, right? There's all kinds of really cool things, like 1/3. The Egyptians knew about 1/3, 1/6. There's a bunch of other ones that are repeating irrational numbers, right? And you can't. The only way to show them is like that, right? Because you can't show them in the real world because they're constantly repeating. Okay, do you care? Yes, we care. Because this renumerator, the bolo word that we had before, and this renumerator in the Greek sense are different, although they can be considered pretty much the same. This renumerator is what's left over after, for example, you let out for pay and you have something left over. I don't know, did you cheat the guys or what? I don't know, but you had money left over. Where this would be a renumerator left over from an equation. So it's really interesting the Greeks had two words for this. We'll see this as we dig into it. Here's another word that's really interesting. E-K, or I guess E-C-Z-E-T-O-U-S-I-N. Zetozin. This is a declension of the word that I showed you, ecstasis. 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 What's interesting about ecstasis, and you can get it from it, ecstasis. Ecstasy. Ecstasis, ecstasy. It's ek and stasis. So ek is specifically denoting action from origin. So from is a good preposition for it. It can also mean other things from out. And steo, histemi or steo, to stand. Stand. From stand. Okay, so what does that mean? In the Greek, it means literally a displacement of the mind or bewilderment, or like I said, in the English we get the word ecstasy from it.
Stasis.
Huh?
Stasis.
Yeah.
Your mind on hold and.
Yeah, you could put it that way. Stasis, or stasis specifically, steo in Greek means to stand. So if I'm ekstasis, in other words, I'm not quite. I guess there's probably another word in Greek for being like punch drunk or drunk, right? So you're like from stand, but this means I'm, in ecstasy, but a displacement of the mind, So in English, we probably say, what was a grand mal seizure, right? If it were a physical thing, we'd say a grand mal seizure. They also, the word specifically can mean ecstasy, bewilderment, to be, and you notice in the King James, to be amazed, amazement, astonishment, trance. But I always try to pick words that aren't quite translated the way they should be exactly, so that's why I picked them. In any case, you notice that, right? I try to pick words that are not quite translated correctly so we can kind of dig into them a little bit. In any case, I want to remind you, and I even put it on the top, I used space and I put a line there. The first 2 verses in this chapter, because they are critical, and I gave you the translations. The translations, but persuasion stands under an expectation or proof of deeds not looked at. So, if you remember, the NIV is, now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. That's not what it says at all. The whole, if this is, now remember, these are logos to telos. This is a logos to telos, an unstated telos. It is not a Roman or a Hebraic document. So we do not expect an intro, body, and conclusion, right? But remember, this author is writing to all those groups: Romans, Greeks, Egyptians, Hebrews. And so we expect him, the authors, we expect them to keep it in a logos to telos. But guess what we find every now and then? Traces of conclusions and traces of introductions. If you like, this is a trace of an introduction to a logos. And the introduction, the specific point of this logos is the author is giving us, just like a logos to telos, a logical argument to a unstated telos. This is a true break point in this document. Now, it doesn't mean the logos to telos. The logos to telos is still going on from the beginning. It's just we get a new logos to telos. It just happens to happen about 11, chapter 11, which we call the faith chapter. It's really the persuasion chapter. But this allows us. But I want us to focus, because if you understand if you understand the basis for the author's assumptions and definitions, then it is easy, I think, to understand. Well, none of this is easy. It is more easy. It is better way to understand it. So, if we remember, persuasion stands under an expectation of proof of deeds not seen. I think that's what I wrote as a translation. That is a proper translation. But persuasion stands under expectation of proof of deeds not seen. And 2, assigning a reason. In this, the members of the Israelite Sanhedrin became a witness. So the focus of this chapter is the witness of the Sanhedrin. And remember, what is the witness of the Sanhedrin? Not the Sanhedrin in Moses' time. The Sanhedrin in this time was Jesus Christ, right? Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again. The Sanhedrin saw it. Not only did they see it, they did it, right? They're the ones. They brought Jesus and tried him. They brought his accusers and had them as witnesses. Remember that? It's all from the Gospels. And all the people knew this. So this is the point of this, even though it delves into the history, is about this witness. So, we are up to verse 5, and we had gone through, as I said, the focus of this is not about the past, but about the now. So 5 in the NIV says, by faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. Let's see what it says in the Greek. In 5, the by is added. The first word is pistis, persuasion. Enoch was translated metathelemi, to transfer, literally to transfer, metathelemi. That, he should is implied, it's not in there. Not is may, and I was going to give you a may and oo, but I didn't do it. May is oo is an unconditional no, where may is a conditional no. In any case, this gets really complicated. But remember, back to your logic and math. Anyway, See, idio, to see, thantos, death, and was, the was is implied, not, and it's oo. So one is me, and one is oo. Not found, herishko, to find, because, dideo, on the very account that. It's not because, it's didoti, on the very account that. God had metathemi to transfer him. It's not him, it's himself. What's interesting is many of these autos, you guys know about reflexive pronouns, right? You should know they're the most misused pronouns in the English language. Because you hear kids, especially kids, and even adults, instead of saying me, which is the proper, they'll say myself. For example, they'll say something like, John and myself went to the store. It should be John and I went to the store. Or they'll say, he went to the store with John and myself. It should be, he went to the store with John and me, right? They'll put in a reflexive pronoun because they've not been taught what a reflexive pronoun is. In a reflexive pronoun, you always are referring back to the, it depends. We don't do this in English. In English, you can have I self. We don't have I self. In Greek, you can have I self, myself. In German, German doesn't have this, but you can have ich self. You can have mich self. You can have, what's the other one? Mir self, mir self. In other words, you can have the, nominative, this is dative, and this is accusative form, right? So I'm not trying to teach you different language forms, but we call them differently in English. We call this the noun, subject. We call this the subject. We call this the object of the predicate, and we call this this object of the predicate. This the object and the object of the predicate. I think that's right. Anyway, I like to think of it in terms of regular language. And in any case, our translators like to translate them incorrectly into Greek because we don't have forms for these in our language. And so it's very easy for them to throw in stuff. The only problem is when you throw it in, you're creating confusion. So when we retranslate it more properly into the correct sense, and sometimes I'll say it like his self, like in this case, I've done that, I put his self in, for example. So it says, autos, him, in this case it's himself, for gar, assigning a reason. And remember, whenever you see this gar, it's a literal logos to telos statement in Greek. Before, and it's not really before, but it's okay, it's pro, meaning for. His, autos, it's really his self. Translation, metathesis, is transposition. He had this testimony, and it's martyrio, to become a witness, that he pleased you arrestio, to gratify entirely God. Okay, that's the Greek. Here's a literal translation, or literal. Here's the literal. Persuaded, Enoch was transferred to heaven, the not to see death, and not found on the very account that God transferred himself, assigning a reason for himself, his self, transposition to heaven. He became a witness. He gratified entirely God. Okay, here's a translation of this. Through persuasion, Enoch was transferred to heaven, so as not through persuasion. Persuaded, Enoch was transferred to heaven, so as not to see death, and was not found on the very account that God himself transferred him. In other words, God himself transferred who? Both himself and Enoch, right? Assigning a reason before his transposition to heaven, he became a witness by completely gratifying God. In other words, why was he transferred to heaven? The assumption gives you that he was commended as one who pleased God, right? The thing is, the deed of gratifying God, was it visible or invisible? It wasn't a visible thing, right? Somehow he gratified God. It didn't tell us exactly how he gratified God. But the deed itself was invisible. The deed was done in secret. But the action itself that happened is the witness. And this goes back, remember I told you before, I know this is getting a little complicated, but this is the way, this is the way it is. So if you remember, the very first one, the third one, it says, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. The literal translation is, persuasion exercises the mind to show that ages were completed thoroughly from an utterance of God, which caused them to become evident. Did anyone see God utter the utterance that created the universe? No. But how do we know that God created?
Because it's here.
Because it's here. In other words, how do we know that Enoch pleased God? Did God tell us? Hey, Enoch, please me. How do we know?
Because he did not taste death.
Because he did not taste death, he was translated, right? We think the whole point of this, and it goes back to one. It goes back to the first and second. The first being the most important. Persuasion stands under an expectation of proof of deeds not seen. The deeds of those who were persuaded weren't seen, right? In some cases, we're going to get to some that they are seen, but then we'll see that remember the previous chapter. The previous chapter, the writers are telling them to not, basically they're telling them to get out into the culture, right? Because if they're not in the culture, then what's not going to happen?
They're not spreading the gospel.
The gospel will not be spread. The word of God will not be spread. And therefore, what is the ultimate deed of that? The gospel spread, right? It's not like the deed of Christ is Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again, right? If I go and talk to you in private, does anybody know? No, right? But if he comes to be persuaded, then what have they done? The deed, right? The deeds occur. It's happened. And you know, we kind of see this, right? What happened in the ages, what happened to the Roman church? Or what happened to the Romans? They were persecuting the Christians, right? Up to about the 3rd century. And then what happened?
Constantine.
And why did Constantine do what he did? Some say he was converted, some say he wasn't. I don't know. What did Constantine have to do? And why did he have to do it? The Christian group had become so powerful within his empire. His whole empire. The whole empire. The whole Roman Empire. That he had to do something, and he went to the point of becoming a Christian, because if he didn't, it would have been the end of his empire. In other words, were the deeds, the deed that was seen was he capitulated, right? He capitulated 100%. But were the actions that caused that, were they really seen? No, they were killing like crazy. You remember, if you remember what it says, Paul even writes about, I could be fighting wild beasts at Ephesus. Guess what? Christians were, no kidding, fighting wild beasts at Ephesus and dying. So the church was persecuting and killing them like crazy. And yet the end of that was they became, the whole empire fell. I mean, it took 300 years, right? But it happened. And I think if we think about this, the foundation is being laid in Hebrews. And what's really important about Hebrews is the foundation that's being laid in Hebrews is probably the most intellectual. Okay, let's think about this a little bit. I got Jerusalem. Jerusalem's trounced, right? I got Babylon. It's Parthians. You can't do anything about that. I got the Galil, and it's trounced. And then I got Alexandria. Over here, I got Rome. And I got Athens up here. What is the center of intellectualism in the world at this time?
Alexandria.
I would argue Alexandria is big time the center, because what had happened is, if you remember, we had broken Alexander coming from Macedonia. Macedonia. Did he care about Athens? Nope. From Macedonia, he went out and he conquered, and after he died, they broke it into the Macedonian, the Seleucid, and the Egyptian.
The Ptolemy. His descendants, the Ptolemy. Yeah, Cleopatra's folks.
Yep. In Egypt, which is Ptolemy. Anyway, those are the names of his generals. The generals was Seleucid and this empire. So we had three empires, and guess what? Athens was losing. What was the language of the classics now? Koine Greek. Koine Greek is the language of the classics. It used to be Athenian, classical Greek. As a matter of fact, I told you, I think Paul, when he writes, is trying to write in good classical Greek. I don't buy this thing about Koine being so different than classical Greek, because he was trying to write in the best Greek of the time. But the best Greek of the time was being defined by Alexandria, right? And the best Greek of the time was being defined by the trade. And Jesus Christ spoke the best Greek of the time. It's kind of like, if you've ever been to Germany, well, if you even haven't been to Germany, what German do you learn?
Hochdeutsch.
Hochdeutsch, yeah. Hochdeutsch, you don't learn Bernisch, you don't learn Pfälzisch, you don't learn Altisch, you learn Hochdeutsch, period, dot. Because that is the language. If you go to France, you learn Parisian French. Well, maybe, because Parisian people think that their French is the best. But if you ever go to France, you'll find that each of the areas have different languages. And by the way, they'll ignore you. They ignore each other, speaking in their colloquial dialect. So you better be speaking normal French. And the Parisians won't talk to you if you don't speak Parisian French. There's also Moscow Russian. By the way, do we have this problem in our country? You ever heard somebody from New Jersey or New York, right? Or Massachusetts or from the South, right? And every time you hear them, what do you think? Well, if a person from New York and New Jersey hears you with your Midwestern accent that you don't think you have an accent, they're like, flyover country, right? If a person from the South, you hear a person from the South, a lot of people think, they're just Southern trash, right? Right? Unless you have high Southern. There's high Southern, there's low Southern, there's all kind. Look, I'm not kidding you. You know this exists. You never even have thought about it. But in the ancient world, they had the same thing. You could literally tell where a person was from. Do you remember the password, Shibboleth, right? Because that the one group could not pronounce the SH sound, right? People died because of this, okay? So better be able to pronounce. In any case, better be able to say glottal stop kind of languages, another thing. Or you're dead, right? In any case, Alexandria is probably the center of the the world of education, of writing, of learning, of all that. And guess where the Hebrews went? Everywhere, right? And then in Rome you had Paul, but Paul was dead in 55 AD. And this was probably written, remember we said after 70 AD. I wouldn't say very far after that, but after they'd had a little time, so maybe 80 AD. So in 80 AD, all of a sudden you had this Christian philosophy, this Christian ideology, and the Christian logos to telos that went around the world. And I would argue that this logos to telos not just affected people, they were persuaded, right? And so this persuasion chapter, one of the reasons it's so important is to tell you not how to take over an empire, although, hey, if you want a plan, here's the plan, right? Let's go on. I also want to note this. Notice the importance was first the witness that persuaded and then the action. In other words, the persuaded, okay, it doesn't tell us how Enoch was persuaded, but how do you think Enoch was persuaded? Maybe through intellectual, like thinking about it, rationally, right? Yes, ma'am.
I think it's possible to have direct communication with God. He wasn't that far from Adam.
I don't necessarily disagree. I don't necessarily disagree with that. It doesn't tell us, right?
No, it doesn't.
Exactly how. But, you know, as each of us live our lives, if you go back, this is why history is so important. If you go back and read, for example, Edward, what's his name? Edward, the great American philosopher, Edward, he did a bunch of the philosophies for God based on motion and infinity. Edward, and he also had what was his name? Edward. Anyway, he said, and not only Paul, right? Paul and Edward and Teresa of Avila and a lot of Christians in the past have said that they had experiences that were awe-inspiring to them. Either that God spoke to them directly or that they had experience. Like Teresa of Avila said she spoke directly to God. God told her, right? Paul said God told him and spoke to him. Edward said God spoke to him. There are lots. There's not just a few. There are a lot of people in history that said that God spoke to them and caused a significant emotional event that changed their way of thinking and moved them in a way, right? And those people, by the way, the Catholic Church calls them, look, man, I haven't thought about this in a million years. The Catholic Church calls them, what do they call them? Not martyrs. Mystics. And I should have left the picture on the page. One of the big things about anticretal is the modern Christian mysticism, which we would call evangelical, which is it's not a bad thing. Okay, don't get it wrong. It's not bad. Anyone heard of the Cursillo movement? You never heard of the Cursillo movement? Cursillo movement is a movement in Orthodox Church, and I don't think Lutherans have one. But it says that God can, if I let myself be open to God, God can speak to me. And you know what? Jesus, okay, I'm touching theological, I guess. In all the New Testament, there's an assumption that if you speak to God, God can speak to you, right? If you are in line with God, then God can work through you, right? The Holy Spirit acting in you. You guys know that, right? Y'all are persuaded that that can happen, right? And so some people have written about it. I'd say I've had inspiring moments in my life that I thought were, where I came to a sudden realization. As I've gotten older, I found I have more and more of these inspirational moments just because I'm thinking about stuff, right? Today I told you I had an idea that just popped in my brain as I was going. I was thinking about moles and molarity. I don't think it has any pertinence to the lesson, But sometimes I'll be thinking about what I'm going to talk to you about, and all of a sudden it'll click in my brain. Bang! Right? And I'd say that's an inspirational thought. Now, where does that come from? Does it come from the chemical imbalance in my brain? Does it come from God? Does it come from the Holy Spirit? Right? I'm persuaded that it's not just simply my rational thinking. It's when I can fit things together to make them cogent. And hopefully it's cogent to you too when I try to explain it to you, right? I try to put it into examples or whatever. I'm just saying that Edward, what's his last name? Edward. Anyway, in history there are lots of mystics, okay? And all of us might be mystics. The point of this is that Enoch somehow got this revelation to the point that it says he was euaresto. He gratified God entirely. His thoughts, his mind, his actions, whatever it was, right? Remember, David didn't gratify God entirely, but he was still considered a man of God, right? Now, we've got to tie this, so Genesis 5:21 and 5:24. So this is Genesis 5. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll read, I guess, the beginning. Chapter 1 or 5:1. This was written in the account of Adam's line when God created man and made him in the likeness of God. And this is specified at the beginning, so I think this is important. And it goes on. He created them male and female and blessed them. And when they were created, he called them man. When Adam had lived 130 years, it goes on and on. This is begat. And then we get, altogether, Jared lived 962 years. This is 20, and then he died. 21. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. And after he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. He says he walked with God 300 years. Now, a walk with God is also a euphemism, but it says you walk with God. I'll go for that. Altogether, Enoch lived 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more because God took him away. Interesting. Very interesting. Now, I do want to throw out, people get all whacked about the numbers. I want to remind you something. What are numbers in Hebrew? Hebrew does not have vowels, right? The numbers in Hebrew are the consonants. And the problem with numbered consonants and problem of this time, and I want to throw this out to you because one of the first things that you will be confronted with if you talk to someone about the Old Testament who is a semi-learned human being from the university, they'll say, what? How could people live so long? And you need to have a response. And the response is, number one, years, okay, can any of you, without a calendar, tell me when the year begins and year ends? No, you can't. Which one are you going to use? Sihedral, lunar, or earth-based? Sun-based, earth-based, or lunar-based? Your choice. The Hebrews use lunar. Did you know that? How do you know what a month is? By the way, there is no word in Hebrew, there's no specific word in Hebrew for year. It's a form of word. It's a formation word. It means a folding of months, of lunar months. There is not a word for lunar month. It means a set of days. Specifically back to calendar, there's only two words for time in Hebrew, Yom and Olim. Yom means a specific set time, and Olim means eternity. So with a very simple thing, and a problem that consonants are the way you form the thing, and nobody knows when a year begins and a year ends. Your rabbi would have explained this to you when he taught you the Torah. Unfortunately, we have our own translations. This goes back to the translation issue I was telling you about. And so we all go home and we look, and we don't know what a year means in Hebrew, nor in the Septuagint in Greek, and we don't fully comprehend. So, the best thing is probably to not get into an argument with someone about this, but tell them these are ancient documents and it's really difficult to determine specific time. Very difficult. Because the time is, number one, difficult. Numbers are difficult, right? And so I'll leave it to the experts. You know, there's some people that are more expert about this than others. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying that it is difficult to reason this and do this. So if some believes the whole world changed with the flood, or some believe that something happened, I'm saying I don't know, because all I know is that ancient languages are difficult. So I'll leave it at that. And remember, nobody knows what a year is yet. So how do you define a year if you know what a year is? Just saying. So, but you've got to have a way to answer. I brought this up to a friend of mine, and I said, people are going to ask you questions about this, and you need to have some answer that is cogent, that is based in logic and reason, right? And the way you might talk to one person might be different. If I'm talking to you as a Christian, I'm going to talk to you in one way, right? Of course, it was 300 years, right? But the way I'm going to talk to you, if you're a maybe semi-educated person from the university, might be completely different than the way I'm talking to you here. You know what I'm saying? Just like I said, I love the Big Bang, because the Big Bang proves there's God, right? So I'm going to be conversing about the beginning differently with you than I would with somebody from the university. Just saying. Because that gives me a foothold into the world and a way of persuading them. Get it? Anyway. And also from wisdom. Wisdom is one of the apocryphal documents, Wisdom 4:10. There were some who pleased God and they loved by him, while living among sinners were taken up. So in wisdom it says, and I didn't do the whole context because we should do the rabbinic context, right? But there were some who pleased God and were loved by him, and while living among sinners were taken up, which refers back to Enoch. All right, let's go to 6. I wanted to do me and oo, but I won't do that. That's getting really complicated. 6. Here's what it says. And without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Without faith it's impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. That's what the NIV says. Okay, here's what it says in the Greek. It doesn't say but. It starts with ekstasis. Ekstasis. Displacement of the mind. A displacement of the mind. Without. And it's not without, it's choris. Remember choris? Choris is a word for chasm. The word for chasm comes from choris. It means out of space. So a space, literally. The Greeks are thinking space. Out of space, not faith, pistis, persuasion by a logical argument. It is added, impossible. It's ad undatos. I was going to give you this word, but it means unable or impossible, so it's close enough. To please, you arresto, to please. Do you notice? This is the same word that was used about Enoch. Now our translators translated something differently, but it's the same word. So what does that obviously mean? This statement applies directly to the previous statement. So it's impossible to you arresto, to gratify entirely, him is added. For, gar assigning a reason. He that, it's not he that, it's the, cometh. Pro serkomai, to approach, to come near, it's close enough. To, it's not to, it's ho, it's the, God, theos. Must is die, it is necessary. Believe, pisteo, to be persuaded by a logical argument. So here we have faith, persuasion, and belief. Pisteo, to be persuaded by a logical argument. That, tote, that, he is, and it's he is. It is he is. It's esti. Remember I told you, anytime you see esti or imi, those are direct, and not notional. They're not like English. They don't just throw them out like we do all the time. Kai, and that is added. He is gnomai, to cause to be a misdapodotes, a remunerator, a remunerator of them that, and it's not of them that, it's ho, the, diligently seek, ek zeteo, to search out himself. All right, I know this is complicated. Here's what the translation is. Here's a direct, literal translation. A displacement of the mind, or direct literal, a displacement of the mind at a space persuasion by a logical argument, unable, impossible to gratify entirely, assigning a reason thee to approach, in other words, to come near the God. It is necessary to be persuaded by a logical argument that he is, and to cause to be a renumerator, the search out himself. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, here I'm going to try to, here's a translation. A displacement of the mind at a space from persuasion. A displacement of the mind at a space from persuasion. Okay? So, if I'm persuaded, I'm totally using logical reason, right? A displacement of the mind at a space separated from persuasion by a logical argument is impossible to gratify entirely. Is impossible to gratify entirely. Do you see what he's saying? In other words, he's...
I mean, it can't be fully explained by a logical argument. Is that the
No, I think it's the opposite.
opposite where it can be fully explained?
I think he's saying we like to have faith. Faith is in something we would say that's not logical, right? A displacement of the mind at a space from persuasion by a logical argument is impossible to gratify entirely. In other words, what we call faith is impossible separate from reason. Isn't that true? If I tell you, what is your kid? Okay, you're my kid. And I say, believe it because I believe it. And what do you say? I'm not going to believe it because you believe it, right? Because now if I go to you and I give you, all right, if I say, you got to be home by curfew. And you say, well, I'm not going to be home by curfew. You say, if you're not home by curfew, I'm going to beat you. No, I'm going to take all your allowance away, right? And lock you in your room for a week. And you go, what just happened? Right? One is a logical argument that doesn't have a very good consequence for me. The other one is just a statement, right? We'll proceed from this, but I think this 6 is a very important verse. A displacement of the mind at a space from persuasion by a logical argument is impossible to gratify entirely. Assigning a reason that come too near God, it is necessary to be persuaded by a logical argument that he is, and to cause to be a renumerator those who search out himself. You want to think about, I didn't write that all down for you, but think about this idea, and we'll talk about it next week. Thank you, Lord, for your word. We pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray. Amen.